undermining Māori self-determination, dismantling Māori culture and society, and eroding the mental health and well-being of Māori. And mission schools were the earliest beginnings of the colonial education system in New Zealand, and Christianity played a vital role in turning the myths of white supremacy into educational policies and practices. The British government partnered with mission societies to provide industrial education that would transform Māori from heathenism and barbarism into the supposed superiority of British Christianity and civilization. The report said colonial racism and white supremacy were the bedrock of the civilizing mission, ostensibly to uplift Māori from barbarism to civilization based on notions of European superiority and Māori inferiority. And as Felicity Jens has observed, that such work was never neutral or benign. It was always connected to political power and often formed part of the epistemic violence that was inflicted on non-European peoples in colonized lands. The entanglement of education, Christianity, and colonialism meant that British colonization was essentially a pedagogic enterprise, a teaching enterprise, and a particularly Christian one at that. Victorian Britain was Christian Britain, and British Christianity provided vital networks and relationships and ideologies and justifications for the civilizing mission of education within what Tony Ballantyne calls the webs of empire. I use Ballantyne's metaphor of the webs of empire to describe the nature of power relations within imperial settings. A lot of the new imperial histories have noted the relationship between the metropole, and in this case that would be London, and the colonies, like New Zealand, Australia, India, Canada, and so on. And that the transnational flow of ideas that move from the colony to the metropole and back and forth, not just ideas, but relationships and power moves back and forth like spokes on a wheel. What Ballantyne argues, though, is to extend this idea that actually ideas and people and relationships and power flow not only vertically between the metropole and the colony, but also horizontally across, between, and within the colonies. So Australian mission schools and Canadian mission residential schools inform New Zealand practices and back and forth. So imperial history is a multi-sited reality with a centre in the metropole extending into bundles of relationships in the peripheral colonies, which then form their own centres with distinct relationships. So it's within these bundles and clusters of relationships between missionaries, politicians, and policymakers, all of whom were Christians mostly, that ideas about Indigenous people like Māori and education were exchanged and developed. So it happened within what I call the webs of Christian empire. Christianity was represented not only by missionaries and church leaders, but also politicians and policymakers and educationalists who were also often Christian, or at least drew on Christian ideas to justify what they were doing. So this paper examines the partnership between the British government and mission societies to provide residential industrial education that attempted to transform Indigenous peoples from heathenism and barbarism to what they believed was the superiority of British Christianity and civilization. In particular, I focus on the mutually beneficial partnership that happened between Sir George Grey, who is the one on the right, and Archdeacon Robert Maudsley of the Church Missionary Society on the left. Their partnership was to establish a system of residential industrial mission schools as part of a wider British Christian humanitarian intervention to assimilate Māori into European ways of knowing and being. So my concern in the paper is to examine the role that Christianity played as a justifying tool that gave divine sanction to British colonization, what I call divinised imperialism. And my hope, thinking in the wake of the work of someone like James Cone, who would argue that theology's greatest sin is its inability to talk about the way it is embroiled in white supremacy. So my hope is that theology begins to address its silence about theology's deep entanglement with the modern racial configurations and the ongoing legacy of colonization. That's my hope. I do want to note at the beginning of this paper that it discusses the painful realities of residential mission schools and the Waikato land wars. Waikato is a region we'll come to talk about in New Zealand, in which thousands of Māori lost their lives through British invasion. So these aren't polite academic inquiries, but discussion about imperial conquest, slaughter, the dispossession of Māori and Indigenous people from their lands, the displacement of Māori tribes, and the entrenchment of intergenerational social and economic disadvantage, the legacy that we continue with today. My subject position as a Pākehā, as a European, is as an inhabitor and an inheritor of the unearned advantages of settler colonialism that continue on today. The focus of the paper is upon Pākehā settlers, European settlers, who utilised Christianity and Christian theology as a justifying tool to structure the myths of white supremacy into reality. I don't have the whakapapa, or what's called the genealogy, or the mātauranga, the indigenous knowledge, or the knowledge of te reo Māori, the Māori language, to interpret Māori realities or represent Māori action. So the focus of my work is upon the webs of the British Christian Empire, primarily Protestant politicians, missionaries, and church leaders, most of whom were male. Mission societies believed in the need to establish systems of education for native children to rescue them from ideas that they had about the ignorance of Indigenous people and train them in the knowledge of Christianity. The CMS believed in the need to extract children from the polluting influence of their home environment and receive them into the care of missionaries and mission schools that would then mold them to become agents of civilization and Christianity. It was hoped that under divine blessing, these children would become, quote, the means of extensively diffusing civilization and Christianity. During the early 19th century, the British government developed policies for universal education initially at home, and then they had to think about universal education in the colonies. And debates existed as to whether Indigenous education in the colonies was the responsibility of the government or whether they should be leaving it in the hands of the mission societies that had already been running schools. And what developed formally was a collaboration between the mission societies and the British government to co-construct education in colonial settings. The government partnered with mission societies to co-construct educational policies and practices as a humanitarian intervention. However, as Rebecca Swartz notes, recognising education as a humanitarian project does not avoid the immense violence and inequality that was wrought by colonisation. Instead, it recognises the ambiguities of humanitarian projects, that not all humanitarianism is humane, and where often care and control are always informing each other. The educational interventions that Maudsley and Gray enacted in New Zealand were local expressions of the wider British policies and ideologies and practices across the empire. Robert Maudsley was a very talented, sacrificial, hardworking, and resilient person who developed one of the largest mission schools in the country. He was appointed superintendent and archdeacon for the Lower Waikato, and I'll come to show you where that is on a map, because I'm conscious you may not have any idea where New Zealand is and what it looks like. He strove to develop a sustainable system of education on a meagre CMS budget. He was responsible as well for training many of missionaries in the practices of running mission schools and stations, and those missionaries went on to develop schools throughout the country. Maudsley was an outstanding linguist. He was involved in developing the Māori Bible, or Te Paipara Tapu. He translated the scriptures from Hebrew into te reo Māori, and for that he was awarded an honorary PhD from Trinity College in Dublin. He also played a vital role in procuring signatures for the Treaty of Waitangi, which is New Zealand's founding document. Maudsley was a driven man, fired by a sense of God's call and a singular commitment to God's cause as he saw it. Along with his many achievements, Maudsley endured a lot of hardship, including the death of 2 of his wives, severe illnesses, fires that consumed most of their house and their possessions, and threats of death during the Waikato Wars. Sir George Grey, Governor of New Zealand twice, was raised in an evangelical household. He was a politician, but raised as an evangelical. And he believed that, quote, duty to the Queen and her empire was inextricably linked with duty to God. He viewed his appointment as governor as divine providence And his plans for racial amalgamation, he believed, were the outworking of God's purposes for the country. He said you are either God's ministers to give effect to God's desires for the welfare of creatures, or are turning traitors to that duty to prevent his wishes for the welfare of all being carried out. Gray's reputation grew when he wrote a report outlining a scheme for colonial race relations and governance for Aboriginal Australians. He was first in South Australia before he came to New Zealand. And in this report, he argued that previous attempts to amalgamate had failed because they'd allowed Aboriginal Australians to keep elements of their customs and laws to coexist with British customs and British laws. So instead, he insisted that Aboriginals be taught that British laws and customs superseded their own to prevent them from, quote, remaining hopelessly immersed in their present state of barbarism. In New Zealand, Gray developed these ideas of amalgamation more formally through the establishment of institutions like residential industrial schools. Maunsell and Gray established a friendship that lasted for 40 years. There's correspondence between them for over 40 years. Their partnership was a local expression of the wider British policy of government and mission societies co-constructing native education. Maunsell held Gray to be a far-seeing leader. At the close of Gray's first governorship, Gray had 2 governorships. He wrote, "Governor Gray has indeed been a benefactor. God has blessed us in sending such a man to this island, and most delighted shall we be if he returns." Now, it turns out that Gray did come back for another governorship. Now, you may read Maunsell's words here and think very little of it. Gray in modern day New Zealand is certainly someone who's a contentious figure, and many would argue strongly that he was the architect of the invasion and slaughter of Māori. And yet here Maunsell is lauding him as God's blessing. Maunsell, at the end of Gray's first governorship, Maunsell and his scholars at his mission school published a farewell address of thanks to Gray, noting his input into their advances in civilization and many children receiving instruction throughout the empire owing their success to him. On a personal note, Maunsell held that Gray's intervention had enabled his mission station in school to move at a much greater pace than would otherwise be enabled, and that his intervention in shifting them to a more fertile field was the most gracious interference of God's providence. They shared a religious persuasion as Anglicans and an interest in education, which was furthered in Gray's second governorship. So circling back to Maunsell arrived in New Zealand as a convinced educationalist. Whilst the CMS was a missionary society, he noted that there's an organic relationship between Christianity, patriotism, and benevolence that unites education with missionary labour. So he said schools are, quote, the pivots and springs of missionary success. Maunsell began his mission. This is a map of Aotearoa New Zealand. 2 main islands, North Island and South Island. North Island Te Ika Maui, and the South Island known as Te Waipounamu. Where we're looking at today is this area around here, Auckland being the main centre, and this lower region here being what's called the Waikato. And Maunsell was positioned here at Port Waikato. And this area through here that becomes a really important river we're going to talk about is the Maungatawhiri River. We'll come to talk about that later. If my slides are moving on. This is zooming in a little bit further in Port Waikato, and then what's really interesting to zoom even further, that Maunsell's name from the 1840s and 50s is inscribed literally on the main road in Port Waikato called Maunsell Road. And off it over here, you see Stack Road, named after Benjamin Stack, one of the missionaries that he taught. And this road here is called Ashwell Road, after Benjamin Ashwell, another missionary that Maunsell taught. At Maraetai, Maunsell established a school that by the end of 1839 had an average daily attendance of 70 students that rose to over 100 in the early 1840s, one of the largest in the country. Maudsley's views of Grey didn't get off to a particularly happy start. Maudsley objected to Grey's heavy-handed response to a conflict with one of the major Māori chiefs, Aotearoa. Maudsley told the CMS that Grey was inexperienced and he was very disappointed in him. He appealed to the committee at the CMS to influence the home government, these webs of empire, right, to compel our governor to be more forbearing and more just. In early 1847, Maudsley met Grey in person for the first time in Auckland and exchanged views on education and the native race. Grey offered to assist Maudsley in any way that he could, and after their meeting, Maudsley took the opportunity to write to Grey about education. He reminded Grey of their shared views about Māori and education, primarily that Māori should be understood as wards in chancery, or wards of the state, who the government should make decisions on behalf of. He said they are, quote, a strange mixture of the craft and spirit of man with the improvidence and fickleness of the child until they're properly disciplined. Maudsley proposed a system where the government, as guardians, should oversee the sale of Māori lands and take a cut from the proceeds. The money that they make should go into building roads, which benefited those who used them and those who were employed to build them. And he said, whilst this is good, it's not the good that's most suited to Māori conditions at the moment in colonisation, because Māori were not yet ready to be entrusted to manage money or property. The real good, he said, was education. And education was needed for the sake of Māori and the colony. Without education, he said, 9/10 of the population would continue to be, quote, wild, lawless, roaming warriors, disturb themselves and disturbing others. Whereas if they were educated, they would be induced to settle down as useful members of society, fearing God and respecting British authority. Maudsley highlighted the lack of resource and labour that mission schools face, as he wrote to Grey. There was only 24 CMS missionaries and they had to cover an area the size of Great Britain, which was almost an impossible task. They couldn't stay in one location, had to cross vast tracts of land. And Maudsley believed he couldn't leave the work in his mission station to native teachers because, quote, their characters are too unstable, their knowledge too scanty, to enable us to look for anything that is permanent or solid from them. What was needed was residential industrial schools and the financial resources from the government to maintain them. So the CMS didn't have the money to maintain them, so they were willing to support the mission schools, but they couldn't maintain them. Maudsley ruled out the idea of day schools because it couldn't bring about the necessary change in Māori habits and customs that civilization required. They needed to live full-time in the mission school. And this resonated, of course, with Grey and wider British policy. And he reminded Grey that it was the influence of the missionaries, that through the influence of the missionaries, that Māori ceded their lands, and that some of the revenue from those lands should be set aside for mission schools. But he said to the CMS central agency that given Grey's character, which he didn't think was very high at the time, it was unlikely he would reply. So it was very surprising that Grey actually did reply to Maudsley, thanking him for his very interesting letter. And he agreed with Maudsley on the need to introduce a good and permanent system of education in New Zealand that had a fixed and unfailing fund to support these residential schools. In the end, the only way this could truly be resolved between him and Maudsley, or the plans be laid, was to meet in person and talk about it. Grey's reply was a surprise to Maudsley, so he quickly wrote his own, telling Grey in his letter that his letter would be a source of much gratification to my brother missionaries, and they would be delighted to hear about Grey's plans for Māori education. It was around this time that Grey was devising the Education Ordinance of 1847, and its success relied heavily on the support of the missionaries. So Grey invited Maudsley and other leading missionaries to have a look over his draft. The ordinance offered government funding for residential mission schools to provide religious education and industrial training that had to be conducted in English and not in the inferior language of Te Reo Māori. Teachers had to be appointed to manage the schools, and the schools had to submit to inspections, and the cost shouldn't exceed 1/20 of the revenue of the colony. Maudsley replied to Grey, noting that he held high hopes for the bill, which was based on the principles of liberality and justice. And he agreed with the ideas of assisting rather than maintaining schools, but he pleaded for money for things like agricultural instruments, ploughs and fences and flour mills that were needed to teach Māori industrial education. And whilst Maudsley supported the idea of teaching in English as an ideal, it wasn't practical yet because many of the Māori lived in Māori-only districts that had no interaction with English people. And it's long been held that the missionaries played a really key role in preserving Te Reo Māori. And I think that's true to an extent, but we do have to realize as well, they were eager that was often only a practical solution because Māori didn't live near English people. They still believed that English was the superior language that education should be taught in. That's going to become important later in history. Gray's ordinance for establishing residential industrial schooling was an extension of assimilation ideas that he had before he came to New Zealand. His ideas weren't unique, and as Damon Salesa says, they're part of a wider program of British educational ideas. Dr. James K. Shuttleworth was the Secretary of the Council on Education in Britain, and he was the leading educationalist in Britain of his time. He was also a Christian who believed that Christianity and education were the central sources for civilization. So when he designed the idea for universal education in Britain, he drew on his medical experience of working among the poor in Britain to devise a model for industrial education for Britain's poor and destitute orphans, the Irish and Scottish savages, and then later he took that idea for the British colonies. Having never visited, he thought the best idea for the colonies is to use what we've used for the destitute poor in London and the savages of the Irish. He was a strong believer in personal responsibility and to hold people accountable for their own misfortune. So if you're poor, you need to reflect on what you've done to make yourself in that position. Christian civilization for a semi-barbarous class required the development of moral and physical training, along with religious and educational instruction to inform each other. So physical industrial pursuit and religion was the basis of education. Through industry and religious instruction, the destitute or savage children would be turned into, quote, an efficient and virtuous members of society who would promote the growth of a truly Christian civilization. In 1847, he wrote this very influential book called Brief Practical Suggestions for Industrial Schooling Among the Coloured Races of the British Colonies, initially for use in Jamaica and then all of the coloured races of the British Empire. And the objectives of K. Shuttleworth's system were these: to inculcate and promote the principles and influences of Christianity, accustom native children to habits of self-control and moral discipline, spread the knowledge of the English language as an agent of civilization. Along with teaching writing and arithmetic, he hoped to make schools the means of improving the peasantry. So again, Indigenous people are to be understood as the peasants, by teaching proper diets, cleanliness, ventilation, and clothing. Students would be trained in the household economy and the cultivation of a cottage industry, all of which should come second in importance only to instructions in the Holy Scriptures and the duties of religious life. K. Shuttleworth's industrial model aimed at making Indigenous people comfortable labourers or peasants who enjoyed improved conditions through the civilizing habits of British Christianity. And the costs of this industrial education were offset by exploiting students as free labour and equipping them to be the future working class. Ranganui Walker, a Māori historian, argues that in the New Zealand context, the industrial curriculum prepared Māori for a future as the labouring underclass, or the British brown proletariat. Gray corresponded with K. Shuttleworth on education, and he read and forwarded a copy of K. Shuttleworth's Brief Practical Suggestions to Maudsley, and Maudsley thanked him for it and promised to adopt it in his own school. Gray worked quickly to establish a fund to sustain mission schools, underwriting their debts, providing personnel, funding, resources, often against public opposition, who didn't want to see so much government money being poured into mission schools. Maudsley was grateful for Gray's support and acknowledged that without Gray's support, his mission school would be at least 2 or 3 years further behind where it really was. In turn, Gray used his connections with the missionaries back in the UK in the web of empires to achieve his plans for racial amalgamation. In 1852, Gray wrote to Sir John Pakington, who was the Secretary of State for War in the Colonies. where he celebrated the tranquility and happy state following the rebellion of 1846. This rebellion was Māori rising up to resist British rule. And so he said that such tranquility had two key factors. One was an efficient armed force to put down insurrection, and the second was a large missionary body. Again, this is the government leader in New Zealand. The missionaries, he said, had advanced Christianity and civilization and prepared the uncivilized for contact with the European race. It was through the watchful care of the missionaries in converting, educating, and training Māori that racial tensions were soothed and idolatrous barbarians were won to Christianity and trained in civilized life. No efforts of the government to civilize native races, he argued, could produce a lasting effect unless it is done in harmony with the missionary efforts. Of particular significance were the industrial boarding schools, which Grey believed had played a vital role in imperial pacification, the role of schooling to create imperial pacification. Grey said, as it is considered that a state of half civilization is as bad as no civilization at all, the children are, in respect of food, bedding, etc., brought up in quite as comfortable a manner as the children of European peasants. So again, the idea that the schools are designed to replicate what was the peasantry in Britain. This orientation towards educating Māori as a future peasantry was further endorsed by Henry Taylor, a native school inspector, when he recommended, I do not advocate for the natives, under present circumstances, a refined education or high mental culture. It would be inconsistent if we take account of the position they are likely to hold for many years to come in the social scale, and inappropriate if we remember that they are better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour. So deliberately educating Māori to be the lower class. In 1849, Maunsell was asked by the Bishop of New Zealand to write a book on education. So he wrote a book called Hints on Schools Among the Aborigines in 5 letters. It was a resource guide for other missionaries. He gave a personal copy to Grey, which he dedicated to him as, quote, a small testimony to the zeal and liberality with which he has always promoted the improvement and education of the Aborigines for New Zealand. Without residential boarding schools, he said, it is almost impossible to, quote, form those habits the native population so much need. What was required for the wandering indigenous minds was catechization, and nothing but catechization. School in the mission schools began at 6:30 in the morning in the summer and sunrise at winter, and consisted primarily of scripture readings, examinations of the scripture readings, prayers, hymns, catechisms, English lessons, geography, and arithmetic. After lunch was spent working around the school. The first 2 years in the school were given only to industrial work, and this gendered idea that outside work was for the boys, fencing, farming, and inside domestic work was for girls. And there was very little academic instruction. His preferred employment for Māori was agriculture, as it accorded with their previous habits and did not require an expensive apparatus to undertake. His male scholars, he bragged, could plough, drive a cart, grind at the mill, erect posts and fences, build chimneys, milk and make butter, while the females could wash, sew, sift flour, clean wheat, and make 400 pounds of bread per week. You must not, however, suppose, Maunsell said to the CMS, that all our time is spent in industrial employments. The whole school was examined on scripture at daybreak, along with morning and evening school. However, whilst Maunsell was reassuring the CMS that not everything all the time was spent in industrial employments, the reality is that Māori parents complained that their children were being used for servitude as slaves. And one school inspector noted the lack of academic progress was due to the fact that pupils, quote, have been for the most part occupied herding sheep and cattle. Maunsell was emboldened by Grey's support, and so he decided to write to the CMS and urge them to fall into line with Grey's plans, in which the government would provide funding, and mission societies would supply teachers. He said to them that the old stage of heathenism, conversionism from heathenism, is over. It's been superseded by the age of education, and missionaries that were effective in the first stage are nearly useless in the new one. What he required now from the CMS was teachers and schoolmasters Give us the men, quote, and the means will be found. One group he thought could make good assistant teachers were missionary children. However, their education had suffered because their fathers often had to be away covering these large, vast tracts of land. And they spent a lot of time mixing with native children who were, quote, so slovenly, lazy, lounging, and gossiping in their habits, it would be almost a miracle if their own character was not considerably impacted. The other class of labourers were potentially native teachers, whom Maudsley did not advise paying any wages because he thought it was a stimulant that may appeal to their low nature. Maudsley at times held optimistic views about Māori leaders, but these were most often overwhelmed by prejudiced pessimism. Native teachers could not be trusted to run the school as, quote, the large bulk are very ignorant and unformed in their character. He felt that if a missionary was away for any period of time, quote, a huge wave of ignorance overflows his district, matched only by a return to idleness and heathen habits. Upon return, the missionary basically had to start again. The role of a missionary, Maudsley said in this book, was to wage constant war against idleness. Such work would result in pupils who were contented, industrious, and obedient. He summarized the needs of a school as twofold. First, gather together children for instruction to train in habits of order and obedience according to Scripture, and two, form in them a taste for the diet, clothing, comforts, and habits of the Europeans. So like Kay Shuttleworth and Gray, he stressed that an institution was to be a religious institution, and religion must be the basis of education. The ideals that Maudsley outlined did not always match reality on the ground. Despite the success and growth of Maudsley's school, it faced constant shortages. He said, our children are obliged to sleep by 3s and 4s under one blanket, and we've been obliged to descend to plain potatoes for their food. As to clothes, the greater number of them are not far from being in rags. School inspectors were surprised that anyone could occupy the cold and comfortless makeshift buildings of the school. These conditions weren't the result of Maudsley's negligence. He exhausted genuinely all his networks in New Zealand and Britain and around the colony, as well as contributing his own money and extensive efforts to fund the work. For Maudsley, sacrifice, hard work, and resilience were integral to what it meant to be a missionary and the missionary calling, and even the understanding of the gospel. So deprivation was understood as pedagogical, a way of learning. Quote, scanty, however, as our resources may be, we must remember that poverty is no excuse for untidiness. Life in the mission school was corrective. Maudsley believed that Māori parents spoilt their children and refused to discipline them. Quote, the little things are so little under constraint at home that they attend school only as caprice takes. In Maudsley's opinion, very few parents teach their children anything. He says they're happy if they have a rag to cover themselves. They walk around unwashed, uncombed, spending all their day looking over a fire or catching birds, or playing games with their fellow playmates. The father and mother, having never experienced the benefit of education or training, can't see the necessity of bringing such little things to school or prayer. As a result, he believed Māori children were spoiled and exhibited far too much independence of spirit, and this needed correction. Maudsley went to great lengths to keep the children within the confines of the disciplined life of the mission school. And the role of education was to tame Māori out of their habits and into British habits. But Māori were never passive recipients of the civilized mission. Children often ran away from the mission school and refused to stay. And so Maudsley devised elaborate schemes to catch them before they reached home, because he knew that if they reached home, their parents heard about what was going on at the mission school, they'd never be allowed back. So when escapees were found, they were seized and brought back, and he brought them back, quote, crying and struggling to school. Remember, these are young children, 10 years of age or under. One regular runaway swam across the Waikato River, which is the largest river in New Zealand, a very large river, very fast moving. This runaway swam across it, and no one had ever heard that anyone had done that before. He swam across the river, and went back home to his family, who heard about what was going on, and so the family came and withdrew all their children from the school. On another occasion, a 10-year-old boy escaped without food or water, and he was found. They chased them on horseback, and the kids would often avoid the trails so they wouldn't leave the common trails they'd use so they didn't leave footprints. But they hunted him down and found him 10 miles from school, overwhelmed with fatigue, and they carried him back on the teacher's shoulders, quote, spitting of blood and fever. Morsel assured the CMS that, quote, once in the institution, we hesitate not to use all the discipline we may think that is necessary. As the late Moana Jackson, the Māori lawyer and academic, observed to the ongoing Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care in New Zealand, the roots of abuse and care, which is a massive issue in our country, are found in colonisation. For all Grey's assistants, none were more significant than the fast land deal that Grey brokered for the move to Te Kohanga. This is the mission school. You'll remember on an earlier image, this was just further inland from his first mission station at Maraetai. Grey was passing through the district discussing education, so Morsel said, hey, come to Maraetai and I'll show you around. In the evening, Grey, at Morsel's request, asked Māori for more and better land and said that if they didn't provide it, the school would have to be shut down and move somewhere else. But no land was forthcoming, and so at this point, the people of Te Kohanga offered a block of their most valuable land as a free gift. Grey offered immediately to pay all the expenses, including Morsel's moving expenses, and he stayed up till midnight, discussing the boundaries and getting the signatures to the deed of surrender as quick as possible. The land was surveyed and the grant was given just before Grey finished his first governorship. Soon after the purchase of the land at Te Kohanga, Grey was called to serve as governor of the Cape Colony in South Africa. So he left New Zealand, and his departure was a blow to Morsel. Morsel believed that their shared religious persuasion as Anglicans interested in Christian humanitarianism had enabled them to build residential schools as centres for Christianity and civilization. And Morsel feared that the arrival of the new governor, Gore Brown, would be a problem because he didn't share the same religious views that Grey and Morsel shared. But the fears weren't realised. The Parliament solidified education funding for a greater proportion for 7 years. Still, Morsel became a staunch critic of the new governor, especially of the way that he was handling the wars that were beginning to develop, and this is, we're going to turn to this period now, in the 1860s in New Zealand, between Māori and the British. As more and more Māori land was being bought and purchased and sold or confiscated in some moments, there was beginning to be real tension and wars breaking out. Morsel believed that Brown was a weak and timid, do-nothing kind of man, and he was unfit for the role. And he said that they needed a new governor just like Sir George Grey, whose negotiation skills would bring a solid peace within a fortnight. Well, later that year, in 1861, Morsel's wishes came true. Brown was removed from office and Grey returned for his second governorship, this time in the midst of war and tension emerging in New Zealand. According to Morsel, there was an immediate improvement in the state of affairs because Grey's character as a skillful manager of the Aboriginal races. Since Grey's arrival, he had begun making plans to visit the region of the Waikato, around where Morsel lived. And the Waikato was the area of the Kingitanga, or the King Party, or the Kingitanga was a Māori movement to have a Māori king, to unite the different tribes of Māori together to try and stop their land being taken or sold. And this Kingitanga, the Māori king, was seen to be in direct competition with the British Queen. And the missionaries conflated really patriotism to the Queen with patriotism to Jesus. So Morsel invited Grey to meet with the Kingitanga leaders at his mission station, and Grey accepted the invitation and stayed at Morsel's house for this very, very important visit because war was breaking out with the Kingitanga. The occasion was marked with a lot of pomp and ceremony. An elaborate archway was erected, flags were hoisted, and the Māori children lined the schools and serenaded Grey onto the site with a rendition of God Save the Queen. You can kind of only imagine what that looked like. Grey met with the Kingitanga leaders, the Māori King movement, to discuss the question of land. And so the Kingitanga wanted assurances from Grey that he would protect their land. And Grey wanted assurances from the kingitanga not to use force to resist land sales. And in the negotiations, Grey appealed not to war or threats, but to the character for Christianity and civilization that Māori had learnt in the mission schools. The meeting exceeded Maudslaw's expectations, and he thought it obtained the object of making Grey's friendly relations and friendly intentions known for enforcing the law. Although following the meeting, Grey then posted this big body of soldiers just 40 miles from the kingitanga boundary. The Waikato had a boundary that there was the clear boundary of kingitanga land called the Maungatawhiti stream. Grey placed a large body of soldiers right on that boundary to show that if he needed to, he could strike. This is following peaceful negotiations. Maudslaw said, "This bold step, in every way most lawful and indeed needful, has caused great concern among the whole people, but I fully accept that they will quietly submit to it." However, the kingitanga did not quietly submit to Grey's manoeuvres. Maudslaw bemoaned the low spiritual ebb in the Waikato and in around his region because it had been replaced with political concerns. He was very proud that the Māori in his area had taken to calling themselves Queenites and not Kingites, and had peaceful relations with the government. For Maudslaw, missionary education played a vital role in imperial pacification, in which allegiance to Christ was conflated with allegiance to British supremacy and rule. As war began to develop in the 1860s, Maudslaw asked his local chief that he was working with, Watakukatai, to write a letter to the Queen, which he would be sent on to the government that acknowledged the Queen's supremacy. This was the deep concern. With the kingitanga, we need to acknowledge the Queen's supremacy, even though Māori were losing their land, and state the points on which the Māori minders saw. Kukatai was then asked to go and circulate this letter among his kingitanga relatives. And of course they said, "We're not going to sign that." So Kukatai had to, who was a Christian himself, was now acting at Maudslaw's instructions on behalf of the British Queen. Few, of course, signed in 1862. Grey's steamers progressed further up the Waikato River, and Maudslaw's mission station became a site for building these military steamboats that would bomb into the Waikato area. Maudslaw remained loyal to Grey throughout his second governorship, which was his time at war, and he didn't register any critique of his actions at all during this time, even though now Grey is heavily criticised for invading and conquering the Waikato in direct breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. Sir George's courage and skill in administration, he believed, would result in a prompt termination of these difficulties. However, this was not the case, and tensions escalated in his region around the Waikato. Maudslaw at this time offered two interpretations of what was happening in New Zealand to the CMS. There was a secular interpretation and a spiritual one. From a secular point of view, the previous governor had messed things up, and it resulted in Māori's suspicion of Pākehā, of white people, and a fear of the immense power of Pākehā would result in Māori slavery or extermination. But he offered another perspective as well, a spiritual perspective, he said. And in it, he had said, "Never did a church need a more violent shaking and humbling than the Māori church." This is in the context of war and invasion. The Māori church had been invaded with the spirit of worldly mindedness, self-will and pride. Their Christianity had become lax and descended into cold formalism, and Māori now obsessed over political questions and proud vauntings, holding, quote, a low idea of English, an exalted idea of Māori prowess. Most deeply shall we have to thank our Lord, if he pleased only to chasten and humble, not to destroy them in the coming conflict. So here is Maudslaw praying that God would use the war to humble Māori. Again, this is a war in which thousands of Māori lost their lives. There remain many good elements of good in Māori, even where the spirit of war he thought was rampant, and he hoped that God's sifting would retrieve a large measure of precious salt among them. Maudslaw's reports of peace in his district had to be revised within a month. Waikato had entered the war, and many in his district had gone to join Waikato Māori. And on Saturday, 11th of July, 1863, a fairly infamous date in New Zealand history, Grey Governor Grey gave an ultimatum for Māori in Auckland and the Waikato area to either swear loyalty to the Queen, deliver up their arms, or else leave the area. And at this time, Grey instructed for the British troops to cross the boundary of the Kingitanga land, the Maungatawhiti River, which I mentioned earlier. This is the Maungatawhiti River through here. This was the agreed boundary of this region here that was all Kingitanga land. Grey actively invaded the Waikato. Morton was concerned about what these measures might mean for peace, so he took it on himself to go and visit Grey personally on the Monday. Remember, they invaded on the Saturday. Morton's relationship with Grey was such that he could go and visit the governor of the country in the midst of the most significant invasion in New Zealand history and have an audience with him. Grey showed Morton letters that indicated that Waikato chiefs were intending to invade up into Auckland. And so this meeting clearly appeased Morton's concerns, because at Grey's request, he went the next day with the native minister to meet with Māori who were leaving Auckland to try and induce them to yield to Grey's conditions, but they refused, of course. The relationship between Morton and Grey was such now that Morton was willing to act as Grey's war emissary in support of his invasion into the Waikato. Morton often defended Grey's actions when the CMS were asking critical questions about what Grey had done. He argued that there was, quote, no excuse for the conduct of the Māoris in the war, and they richly deserve severe punishment. He argued that Māori are the most suspicious race on earth, and they use that suspicion to justify rushing into war. When the CMS disputed reports about the conspiracy to invade Auckland, Morton defended Grey. He said, I've done my own careful independent inquiry and found indisputable proof of a planned attack upon Auckland. Earlier, Morton had dismissed suggestions of a conspiracy to invade Auckland as little more than fireside speculation. Now he was convinced of the conspiracy, and he gave his evidence to Grey to help justify the invasion. And Grey then in turn took Morton's letters with others and gave them to his superiors in London as part of the evidence for why he should continue to be funded from London for the slaughter of Māori and the confiscation of Māori lands. 1.2 million acres of Māori land was confiscated in these wars, and thousands of Māori were displaced from their homes and killed. In contemporary historiography, this evidence of Morton's and Grey's is highly disputed. In 1995, the Crown, for the very first time, acknowledged that the crossing of the Maungatawhiti was an unjust invasion, which breached the Treaty of Waitangi, and that its labelling of the Māori rebels was unfair. The Crown expressed its profound regret and offered an unreserved apology. And the apology was personally signed into writing and offered by the Queen herself, who was present for the deed. They apologised for the loss of life and the devastation of property and social life that resulted. They acknowledged that Waikato's two principles was that land was taken, land should therefore be returned, and that the money that was offered, the millions of dollars of reparations, was simply an acknowledgement by the Crown of their crime. Finally, the Crown acknowledged that the confiscated lands, the 1.2 million acres, had made a significant contribution of wealth to New Zealand. So the confiscated lands were then, that dispossessed Māori, that Grey used to dispossess Māori, was then given into the hands of Pākehā, who became very wealthy as a result. Meanwhile, Māori who were alienated from their lands were plunged into deprivation and poverty. Queen Victoria was present in person and personally offered the Crown's apology, signing the deed of settlement and agreeing with its historical narrative of what occurred. Going back to this period, as the war intensified, Morton's safety came under threat. His mission school was broken up, and he was warned to stay within his prescribed boundaries or Kingitanga would shoot him. A steamer came to pick up his family, but Morton said, I want to remain with my people because my people have been faithful to me. Here, being faithful to Morton meant being faithful to the Crown, being loyal to the Crown. And this was something that Morton had taught in the name of Jesus for many, many years. In Maudsley's assessment, the murders undertaken by rebel Māori had no provocation from the settlers, who had been strictly on the defensive, but this overlooks the role of the British Crown and Grey's invasion, as well as the missionaries who often acted as spies on behalf of the Crown. Maudsley once again offered a theological interpretation of the war. God has sent the present conflict to humble his ministers and humble and chastise this proud, stiff-necked people. His hope was that it would show the better thinking among them the vileness of their forefathers' customs to which they cling, stir up Christians among them to be more distinct and earnest, give them a stronger passion for the British law, and lead them away from nomadic lifestyles to live in settlements where they can be reached by the minister and schoolmaster. By now, numbers were greatly diminished at his school, and so Maudsley moved to work at the front of the battle, hoping that he could be of some service to this foolish and obstinate people. Maudsley continued his remonstrances with non-loyalist Māori when he saw them in person. He drew from scripture to remind them of their sin. Initially, he wasn't able to interact with the prisoners, so he moved to minister with the troops, marching with them from battlefront to battlefront, where he was often present for the battles. When he was finally given access to prisoners, he took the opportunity to reprove them for their sins, even though they had been invaded and bombed off their lands, endeavoring, quote, to move their consciences to a sense of the many acts unworthy of Christianity of which they had late been guilty. Yet God was not like humans, he told them, and God's ear was always ready to help. He felt for the poor creatures whose fierce pride was dented, and he believed that through this fiery trial, God was preparing them for better things. It remained his hope that the rebels would soon yield, and he continued to hold that he couldn't see any act on the part of the government that could in the least part be condemned. Quote, the people in the most unprovoked manner began the war, and the least they ought to do now is yield to the crown, prompt and full submission. The new year brought no signs of termination of the war in 1864, and Maudsley became more critical of the crown. He blamed Māori still for the war, but he was worried that the government's demands were a bit too extreme. Non-loyalist Māori were expected to give up their lands, give up their arms, and anyone who fought against the government was to be thrown in prison. Some of them were to be shipped off away from New Zealand to live in the Chatham Islands, away from family. And Maudsley's point at this stage was that many Māori in arms hadn't invaded European territories. They'd gone simply to join their families. And they were quite different than the people he believed were the aggressors, primarily from one tribe called Ngāti Maniapoto. He felt that these new stringent measures gave no incentive for a negotiation to peace, and it left them with few realistic options. But really interestingly, Maudsley believed that these measures weren't the result of Grey. He believed that Grey was innocent. He was the meat in the sandwich between meeting the demands of the greedy Auckland MPs who were wanting to take over the Waikato lands and the need to find a just outcome according to English law. So Grey was just a patsy. He was just caught in the middle, trying to negotiate between these two poles. But in contemporary historiography, this account of Grey's professed innocence has been debunked. Vincent O'Malley, one of the leading historians in the Waikato Wars, holds that while Grey sought to portray his stance as a principled one based on justice and moderation, it was he who, by his own admission, had devised the confiscation proposals and who eventually agreed to the wholesale confiscation of Waikato lands. The school that I teach in at Carey Baptist College is on the road called Great South Road. The Great South Road was built as a war road that Grey asked to be built to be able to move down the Waikato from Auckland and invade the Waikato. So we live among these realities and legacies with us today. The lands have still not been returned. In the Waikato claim settlement that the Queen signed into writing, they acknowledged that the confiscations of the land instigated by Grey were entirely wrongful. Grey was entirely at fault, as was the government, and the Queen signed it into writing. For Maudsley, the war had revealed the need for education. Maudsley and Grey had long held that education was a crucial tool for imperial pacification. During earlier wars, Mansell had contrasted the unsuccessful and expensive approach of softening by war with the less costly and more effective approach of softening by education. And so he wanted more funding to come that they would otherwise spend on war. In the midst of the war, Mansell asked for the establishment of day schools and a law that enforced those who were located near to them to send their children. But the problem remained that Māori parents, in his opinion, had not adequately valued or availed themselves of the school. He said their indifference to education of their children was one of the crying sins of Māori, along with abnegating all authority over them and training them in a rampant self-will, the source now of their present troubles. So he blamed Māori parents for the war. As a church, they needed and deserved a severe chastisement that they are now receiving. May God sanctify it to their good. Here, war was seen as God's just punishment upon Māori for not being loyal to the invading British Army. War and the loss of life was seen as didactic. We're teaching you a lesson, a form of imperial education. By this stage in the war, the mission schools were all but broken up. Mansell blamed the resistance of Māori parents for the failure of the schools. They viewed the disciplinarian regimes of the schools as an impediment to the spirit of manliness and independence that they wanted in their children. Mansell complained that they don't allow their children to be disciplined and don't make them work in any case, especially when they run away. He said, quote, and when it, meaning the children, when it does run away, your object is to catch it before it reaches the parent. When once it's under the parent's roof, the chances are 10 to 1 that you won't get it back. In these schools, you must train cleanliness, order, obedience, industry, as well as imparting knowledge. Now imagine what a task that is with wild, unbroken children, their parents backing them up in their unruly conduct. He said the government must adopt measures to make parents exercise authority over the children and not let them grow up as self-indulgent, irrepressible, ignorant barbarians in the midst of European settlements. In the wake of the failure of the mission schools, Mansell changed his views about residential industrial schools. Where he once believed that they were the only way that mission schools should be run, he was now critical. They were too expensive to run. And the lack of willing labour created an unbearable burden on the missionary and their family. Where he once supported the removal of children from their families, now he didn't. He wanted to see them remain with their families. Not because it separated children from their families, but because it relieved the parents of responsibility and created dependency on the government. What was needed were day schools that the family should pay for. If a child was absent without leave, the parents should be made to pay taxes for the absences. And the money that would be gained could pay for a child's meal and some of the schooling. This accorded with Kay Shuttleworth's view that the wider educational policies of the empire, that school fees were didactic. They taught them to value education. Now, however, he added that the tax was a punishment for those who didn't avail themselves of the blessings of education. And by 1869, Mansell concluded that his own school had been a failure. The cause in his mind was still the parents and their indifference to education. What strikes me in reading Mansell's letters and exchanges is that there is no critical self-reflection on his own racist attitudes to Māori and Māori children. There's no critical self-reflection on his nationalistic understanding of Christianity that contributed to him supporting the Crown's unjust invasion and slaughter of Māori, or the subsequent confiscations of land that plunged Māori into poverty for generations. Following the Waikato War, the mission schools were empty. In 1867, the Native School Act was signalled the end of the mission school era and the uncoupling of the formal partnership between the government and the mission societies. The later native schools have received a lot of critique for their civilizing mission, and the ongoing Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care has noted the generations of physical, mental, and cultural abuse, including beating Māori children for using Te Reo Māori and not using English, to the point that the Māori language almost went into extinction. However, mission schools were the primary source of education in Aotearoa for 50 years, and they provided the basis for education on which all subsequent developments were iterated. Any examination of the structural legacy of colonisation and education begins with the mission schools and not the native schools, and the partnership of the mission agencies and the British government. So in conclusion, mission schooling in Aotearoa was a partnership between the British government and mission societies, which embedded the myths of white supremacy into educational policies and practices, and eventually reality. The partnership of Maudsley and Gray provides a local example of the wider colonial structuring of Indigenous education. Christianity played a vital role in establishing ideological, practical, and political networks, as well as providing distorted theological justifications for the entrenchment of the myth of white British superiority. A distorted hamartiology conflated Māori ways of knowing and being with sin, and profited distorted soteriology that conflated British ways of knowing and being to be the salvific solution. Discipleship was distorted as pedagogical formation into British customs, cultures, practices, and loyalties, and a distorted understanding of the Imago Dei presumed nearness to British dispositions equated to nearness to God. These distortions enabled the divine sanction of the invasion of the Waikato as God's retribution. Unsettling theology requires critical examinations of the distorted theologies and ideologies that feign divine authority and support for a civilizing mission. Unsettling theology also requires critical examinations into the historical details of the partnerships and networks forged within the webs of Christian empire that structured the legacies of educational injustice which remain with us today. Anō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Picard, for your fascinating presentation. So let's start with our Q&A session. Let's see if we have questions in the room or online. Let me start first, actually. I was wondering that because the fascinating presentation has a lot of different data, obviously from British colonizers and from missionaries. But I was wondering, is there any sort of fragments or like maybe oral history from like the Māori people and the ways that they discuss themselves or their interactions with Christianity or the British colonial government?
Yeah, there are. There's a lot. Perhaps there's a key Māori leader called Wiremu Tamihana, he was the kingmaker. He literally, when Potato Te Whirowhiro became the Māori king, it was Wiremu Tamihana who placed a Bible on his head to anoint him as king. So Māori were very Christian at this time. Potentially, estimates ranging in the range of 85% of Māori were Christian before the Waikato Wars. So very high rates of Christianity, and regularly writing as Christians to the New Zealand government to say, what are you doing? You are the aggressors, not us. We want a king just like what we see within the Bible. And there's not just one king for Europe. Europe has many kings. Why can't Māori have kings? So there were a lot of Māori, both oral histories and written histories, submitting to the government and meeting with government leaders, negotiating, attempting to negotiate peace. I have deliberately tried not to represent Māori perspectives in the presentation, just because I'm influenced by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's book called Decolonising Methodologies. And her point is that so often Pākehā are representing Māori ideas and Māori views. So for instance, Maudsley is making a lot of money when he publishes the Māori Bible or a grammar of the New Zealanders. He takes that back to the UK, takes Māori knowledges and profits off them. And so there's quite a debate politically in post-colonial ideas, who should represent who. So I've tried to be cautious to represent Pākehā perspectives, European perspectives, and allow Māori to represent Māori perspectives, because there's Māori ideas and knowledges that I don't have. And I think being my inhabitants being from the colonizer, I think one of the major issues to face is the will to mastery over the other, the constant will to master the other, to speak on their behalf, to represent. Yeah, that was my decision not to do that. But there's an excellent book on Wiremi Tamihana by Evelyn Stokes.
Great. Thank you. So let's see if there's questions online or in person. Can you say a bit more about how the sort of Christian missions have affected New Zealand here and now? Because it was very interesting to see how it developed, and I think it will be interesting to also see how it continued to affect how people live here and now.
Yeah, so there's a lot of it's a contended space. Some want to highlight some of the good that missionaries have done, and that's true. Missionaries were involved. There's always sunny sides and shadow sides. I've probably highlighted more of the shadow side. Missionaries were also involved in some really important good things. But many Māori, following the Waikato Wars, Māori Christian adherence dropped down to 5%. And it's fairly common to hear Māori say that Christianity was the forerunner to colonization. And in fact, I mean, missionaries were saying that themselves, that Christianity was the forerunner to colonization and civilization. So the conflation of Christianity with British civilizing ideas was a problem. I think what I'm interested in is the development of is to think of colonization not as an event that happened in the past, but a structuring of reality. It's kind of why I chose education, because education continues to be a major injustice. Māori overrepresented in statistics of failure in education, and so it continues not to work for Māori. But we have to remember that from the 1840s, Māori were taught that their customs, their ways of knowledge, their ideas, their language were all barriers to education. They need to get rid of those things and embrace British ways of knowing. And that continued for centuries. And only now are we beginning to see how Māori, the restoration of Māori language, but also Māori knowledges, Māori histories. So as I think you've indicated, Dr. Chu, Māori history tends to be much more oral. It's handed down through oral presentation. So often, I noticed I made note of the 1995 meeting with the Crown by the Waikato iwi, or the Waikato tribe, Tainui. They presented evidence there that they'd held to themselves and had never written down. It was fully an oral history, and they retold it. And so their songs from this era, they have haka, or haka is a way that knowledge is maintained and preserved. Waiata are songs, so they would sing about these events. They sing about the losses of their people. They sing about what happened. That was able to be presented as evidence in the historical account that had never been heard before. So yeah, my interest is in thinking about the structural legacies. I teach a course called Understanding Culture, and in it, every year we try to engage in these issues of colonialism and think about its ongoing legacy. Most Māori students might be of mixed heritage. They might be Māori ethnicity, and they might be Pasifika, they might be Samoan or Tongan, or maybe Pākehā as well. They do tend regularly to say, I'm Samoan or I'm Tongan, because they feel ashamed of being Māori in many settings, and that's remains a major obstacle to overcome. When I was at Carey, and initially, we simply had no Māori sources to share with them on theology. So they just keep reading white sources over and over and over. And so theology becomes what white men do, and talking about old dead white men. So those are some of the issues I think we're trying to conceive today and think through in my setting. Yeah.
Yeah. So how does education like how has education sort of been able to sort of evolve throughout the centuries to be more sensitive or be more incorporating Maori knowledge or be able to empower Maori people in their own knowledge and who they are?
Yeah, mostly, to be honest, through protest. It's Māori resistance movements, particularly from the 1970s onwards, 1970s, 1980s. Um, yeah, Māori resistance movements protesting things like the loss of the Māori language and the need to create and establish it as an official language of this country. Um, and then the development of what's called kura kaupapa, or Māori educational schools. And we're now seeing that's been in place for a number of decades, and we're now seeing they talk about the kura kaupapa generation, Māori who've been trained in Māori schools with Māori language and Māori knowledges are now coming through into business and into politics and into education and making substantial impact and influence. But it took, yeah, really Māori protest to demand that the government begin to preserve Māori culture and customs. Māori were preserving it themselves in their own areas, but often away from urban centres. So it was that movement. And with that was really interestingly, the church in the 1970s and 80s got involved in protesting with Māori, which I think was, that's been well received by Māori, that the church joined them in protesting what was happening with Māori. I think the next part that I'm interested in thinking is the church rightly was involved in protesting what was happening with Māori, but it needs to think through how it's embroiled in the things that it's protesting about too. So there's some complexity there. In my own setting, it means, for instance, I had a Māori student in one of my courses. In our context, we write a capstone 6,000 word project at the end of the undergraduate degree. And so a Māori student said, I'd like to write it in Te Reo Māori. It's an official language of this country. And so we agreed to that. We found some policy from university and went and explored that. She then met with her elders, her Māori elders, to learn about the history of her land, but it was oral knowledge. And so she felt in conversation with some other Māori leaders that to write it down would do violence to the language. So she asked, I want to present this orally. So we had to think through, how do we do this? How do we present oral knowledge? And who should hear it? Because this knowledge is sacred to Māori, so it wasn't open to everyone hearing. And then who should examine it? Because I don't speak Te Reo Māori. I may know the theological ideas, but I don't speak the language. Other people speak the language, but are unfamiliar with the theological world. So it took 4 or 5 of us to be able to come together to assess a piece of work. And what it highlighted to us is the way that still now colonisation has shattered things to pieces. And we are really working among the shards that have been left over from that shattering process.
That is fascinating because I'm kind of drawn to the idea of making the language part of official, and in Hong Kong as well, there has been official language movements in last century where we're making Chinese the official language as well. And there's been protests on that as well. And so we've been doing like a oral history database in our university. It's online, it's available. There's also people who have been in Christian organizations who've been part of this official language protests back in last century. And so the sort of colonies and how we experience things are both different and the same as well. And thank you so much. Let me do a bit of housekeeping. First, thank you so much again for being here. You'll continue to be here for a little bit longer for our students in class today, who will have a conversation with you about your writing. But for those who are online, thank you for being here. And those if you're interested in this event or other events that we hope to be doing in future, so one of which is one of our faculty members, Dr. Levi Checkett, who will be having a book launch later this month. It's called Poor Technology, Artificial Intelligence, and the Experience of Poverty. This is an in-person event. And then in March, we have another event titled What Happens If the Brain Goes Elsewhere? Puzzles About Persons, Identity, and Embodiment by Dr. Mark Carey. This is also an in-person event. And then we have another online event that is by Dr. Robin Bure. And this is in April. It's a book launch. Her book is titled Befriending the North Wind, Children, Moral Agency, and a Good Death. And so follow us in all these different ways if you're interested in learning more about what we do. And big thanks to Dr. Prickett for being here with us today. And why don't we come back? Well, everybody else, bye. But like those in person and Dr. Prickett, why don't we come back in like 20 minutes and then we'll continue the conversation on your work.